Welcome to Layer of the Alchemist, and welcome to a new announcement. I have a new podcast that I'm doing with my good friend Mattias. It's an Iron Maiden podcast called A Pod Somewhere in Time. It's only going to be available on Spotify, but we're also going to be making the full podcast episode available in video format here on the Layer of the Alchemist YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it, you can watch it on YouTube. If you want to listen to it, you can listen to it on Spotify. It's going to follow the same format that the Black Sabbath podcast that I do with Darren does, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, where we're going to go album by album, track discussions, history, talk about the B-sides associated with that particular album. Mattias is one of the most knowledgeable Maiden fans out there that I know, so this is going to be a really great podcast that I'm really looking forward to. We have the first episode for you here. We did an episode that was kind of an introduction to us and our history of metal. I only put that one up on Spotify. You can listen to that if you want. That's just a short little episode. But the first proper episode we did was for Iron Maiden's Soundhouse Tapes, and that's what you're going to see here next. So make sure you like and check out A Pod Somewhere in Time on Spotify, or watch the videos here at the Layer of the Alchemist. So let's get into it. Iron Maiden, the Soundhouse Tapes, and A Pod Somewhere in Time. Welcome to A Pod Somewhere in Time. You may be streaming this episode on Spotify or watching the video on the Layer of the Alchemist YouTube channel. Either way, greetings. I'm your host, John, and I'm here with my co-host, Mattias. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Soundhouse Tapes from Iron Maiden. The Soundhouse Tapes is a 3-song EP independently released on November 9th, 1979 by Iron Maiden on their own Rock Hard Records label. The EP would be recorded by Mike Kemp and mixed by Gary Lucas in 2 days on December 30th and 31st, 1978 at Spaceward Studios in Cambridge. Only 5,000 copies were made and distributed through the band's, at the time, mail order service, quickly causing it to be a rare collectible that has only skyrocketed in value since. The EP features 3 songs written by Steve Harris: Iron Maiden, Invasion, and Prowler. Strange World was also recorded during these sessions, but not included on the record. The album would feature Steve Harris on bass, Dave Murray on guitar, and uncredited Paul Cairns on guitar, but we'll get into more of that during the episode, Dave Sampson on drums, and Paul Di'Anno on vocals. Paul sadly recently passed as of the making of this episode, and we will be sharing a few thoughts on his legacy in tribute at the end of the show. Okay, Mattias, here we are. We did our introductory episode introducing ourselves and our history with Iron Maiden. Today, we're going to be talking about the Soundhouse Tapes. But before we jump into the Soundhouse Tapes, why don't you take us through some of the early history of the band leading up to the recording of the EP? Some of this early history can be a little bit murky, as people's memories and dates are not always, 100% remembered. But give us, kind of lead us up here to the Soundhouse Tapes and how Iron Maiden became Iron Maiden and how they got to the lineup that would make this recording.
Yeah, we could talk about the early days of the band for hours on end, I guess. And I mean, there's been books written about the early days, and Iron Maiden researchers that have been looking into most aspects of and try to retrace the early steps of the band. But to keep this a bit more light and simple, I would say that there are a few things that has to be mentioned before we actually talk about the very single itself. And perhaps we even have to dispel some myths about the band too. One is that in the official lore of the band, there's always been this thing that the band was started in the days between Christmas and New Year's Eve of 1975. And there is no that's just something that people says that that was when the band started. I have never heard anyone in the band themselves say that actually, and I don't know where that actually comes from. What we do know is that one of the earliest or the first knowledge lineup of the band was writing songs in November of 1975. There might have been like earlier versions of the band or incarnations of among these musicians leading up to what we know as the first version of the band Iron Maiden. And the first lineup, of course, the band was started by Steve. And we had a guy called Dave Sullivan on guitar, as well as Terry Rance on guitar. On drums was a guy called Ron Matthews. And Ron Matthews later played with such musicians as John McCoy, who was famous from playing with Ian Gillan. And he played on some of McCoy's solo albums in the early 80s. And lead vocalist for the first version of the band was Paul Mario Day. And as I said, we know that this early version of the band was playing and rehearsing as early as November 1975. Another thing is that when did they first do their public gig? Okay, that's also some dispute on when that was. There's this pub in Eastern London called Cart and Horses, which has made like their hashtag the birthplace of Iron Maiden. And they did actually play very, very early on in the Cart and Horses. But was that their first official gig? Maybe, maybe not.
And that place is still there, right? The Cart and Horses still exist, right?
It's a fun story. When I first went there, was for a fan club convention in 1995. Me and my old friend Henrik Johansson, we went looking for this mythical place, the Cart and Horses. And we got there, and this very dull pub. And we went around, took some photos, and I mean, this was midday. And the landlord himself was like, okay, hello, guys. Who are you? And why are you taking photographs? So we said like, oh, well, this is the place where Iron Maiden played their first gig in 1976. Iron Maiden? Here? 76? And it turns out that this guy, in 1995 that is, has just taken over, was like a new landlord of this of this pub. He had absolutely no idea about world famous heavy metal act Iron Maiden doing like one of their very, very first gigs in his pub in 1976. So that was like, he was, wow, he couldn't believe his ears.
And isn't the Cart and Horses, if you watch the Iron Maiden early years documentary where they're interviewing all the guys, the early guys in the band, isn't that where they're at? They're like at a pub. And is that where they are?
I think most of those interviews were filmed at the Ruskin Arms.
Okay, the Ruskin Arms. Yeah, you're right. And which is another famous early Iron Maiden live place.
They did a lot of gigs there towards the later 1970s. So I mean, it's fair to say that Ruskin Arms was their home base. That's where they were doing gigs regularly in the later part of the 70s. But anyway, the first lineup of the band, they did their first gigs, and it said that maybe they did play their first gig at the Cart and Horses, but it seems like their first paid gig was at a place called the Bridge House in Canning Town in London, and that was in June of 1976. So again, official lore says it's the Carton Horses, the birthplace of Iron Maiden, but we can't really know for sure. And I guess if Steve Harris or anyone brought out their diaries, maybe we could just settle this. But for now, the official version is that they played their first gig there anyway. The first lineup of the band didn't last that long, and I think I counted sometime how many people were in the band before to like the Soundhouse Tapes version of the band. And if I don't remember this wrong, I think it was about 13 people that went in and out of the band during these years. So Dave Murray came into the band in late 1976. And I mean, that's an important thing. Sometimes you read that Dave was there from the very beginning of the band, but he wasn't. And Dave was also fired and out of the band for a while later on. By then, the band had a new singer. They thought that Paul Mario Day was a bit not delivering on stage. I think they thought he was a bit stiff and didn't interact with the audience. And Steve knew about this guy called Dennis Wilcock. Dennis Wilcock was an older guy that he met in a previous band called Smiler. Smiler was a band that Steve played in before starting Iron Maiden. And it's also famous because, according to the official lore of the band, they rejected Steve's song Burning Ambition. Burning Ambition was later on recorded as the B-side for the first Running Free single released on EMI. Because they, quote unquote, thought it had too many time changes. And those of you who have heard the song, which I guess most of you have, it's not exactly rocket science, that song, but they thought it was, let's be fair, they thought it was a bit out of character for the band at least. So they didn't play it. But they did actually play like an early version of Innocent Exile with Smiler. Before Smiler, I just want to mention Steve had his band with a bunch of his mates from school and so on, called Gypsy's Kiss. It was first called Influence and then Gypsy's Kiss. And then when he joined Smiler, he wanted to become a better player and play with older musicians. So he joined another band, and that was Smiler. Anyway, in Smiler, he met Dennis Wilcock, who was the singer for Smiler for a while. And Dennis, when they fired Paul Mario Day, Dennis was the guy that Steve wanted to bring in. And this is also one of the things, one of the myths, as you might say, that we have to address here, that sometimes when you hear people talking about early Maiden, and still to this day perhaps, is that Iron Maiden is Steve's band. He is the leader and he takes all the decisions, which is fair, but only to some extent, because I think we have to point out that being a young player, inexperienced, to have a guy like Dennis Wilcock in the band who was a few years older, had more experience, of course Steve would listen to him. And of course, the band at this time didn't all play just Steve Harris songs. The different musicians who were in the band early on made their contributions, brought in ideas that Steve molded or made into Maiden songs, or they rehearsed and so on. And I mean, this is something we will talk more about when it comes to talking about the first album. Is this thing about the secret credits? Are there like more songwriters than it says on the actual album sleeve? And we can pretty much say that yes, there were other people writing. Why these aren't credited on the recordings, later recordings, we don't know. Maybe that was a decision made by the management that we want to give money to those who are in the band as of now, maybe so. But yeah, I mean, for example, one of the songs we're talking about a little later on here, a song like Strange World, is supposed to have been written even before the band started by the singer Paul Mario Day. And he's been asked about this in interviews, I mean, recently. And he says that I'm fine, it's all sorted, I'm fine, and he doesn't want to talk about it. So, I mean, we can probably assume that he's been getting sort of paid for his work.
Yeah.
Writing a song like Strange World. Dennis, like I said, was also very instrumental in doing the theatric side of the band. Steve always wanted a band to have more on stage than just a couple of blokes playing songs, and Dennis was very instrumental in doing that. I mean, for a song like Prowler, he had this mask on that and a character which was called the Prowler, and this was before the days of Eddie. Another thing that you can often read about is that Steve made the logo of the band, and that is true. But then you think about the classic logo on the, but that's not the logo that Steve did. His logo it was more in the style of like Old English type of font. So for the first poster they had this hooded mystery man and the name Iron Maiden in that kind of Old English font. This font was made by a guy that Dennis Wilcock, he worked on, I think, some sort of arts department or something like that. And one of his associates, I think his name was Ray, made that for the band. And that wasn't an original font, because that had been used earlier. And if you look up, you can find albums like The Man Who Fell to Earth by David Bowie. That's a film also, I think, uses that font. And more funny is that there's an album by a sort of English folk singer called Gordon Giltrap. And he has an album called Fear of the Dark, which was put out in the 70s, which Gordon Giltrap's name is in the Iron Maiden font.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite funny. The font, if you want to find it online, sometimes it's called Busk, don't know why, or Metal Lord. So, like I said, Dennis was very instrumental in the band. He decided to leave the band, and before that, he fired Dave for some childish reason. He also got the first drummer of the band fired, Ron Matthews. So, I mean, it's fair to say that it wasn't just Steve calling the shots in at least during the time when Dennis Wilcock was in the band. Anyway, there was some sort of restart of the band after Dennis left the band. Prior to that, they had a lineup with a keyboard player for like a gig or two. They had just one guitar player. Tony Moore was the name of the keyboard player. Terry Woppram was the name of the guitar player. But Steve decided it doesn't really work to have the keyboard player in the band, that they should be a two-guitar band. And at that time, too, they had Thunderstick on drums for a while. And Thunderstick, as most people know who know your new wave of British heavy metal, was the drummer for Samson, the band that Bruce was later doing his debut in recording-wise, doing the first Samson albums. But then all these people left, and Steve sort of restarted the band. and this was in 1978. Came into the band in around August 78. Now Dave Murray was also back in the band, and Steve decided to bring in a drummer from the band Smiler that I mentioned earlier, who is also on the Soundhouse Tapes, Doug Sampson. So after, when these four are now in the band, they start to search for another guitar player. And you can say that this is the rebirth sort of the band. And even if you read like early biographies, it says that that was the starting point of the band, like just discarding the very, very early days of the band. But they were still playing the same, much of the same material. I mean, a song like Phantom of the Opera was conceived while they had the keyboard player in the band and just one guitar player. Remember Tomorrow was written during that time too. I think it's also fun to mention that early on they played a lot of covers. So what were they playing? And I wrote some of it down here. They did songs like I Got the Fire and Rock Candy by Montrose. They did the Thin Lizzy Jailbreak. They did the Free song, I'm a Mover. And they did a Lynyrd Skynyrd song called Simple Man. And they did the Purple track, Smoke on the Water. And these were songs that they had in their set during the Up Till. And I mean, a song like I've Got the Fire, they even recorded live very early on when they released for a B-side of as their singles. When I'm talking about all this, the early days of the band, people coming and going, I mean, this is, like you say, it's very murky sometimes. And I think it's fair to do a shout out to Luis Mariano Rodriguez, who is one of the top Iron Maiden researchers out there. This is one of his books, and it's called Eddie Made Me Do It. It's Beast Arises from 1973 to 1983, and it tells all of the background, and Lewis is the guy that have tried to fill the gaps of people coming and going when they did that, when they did early gigs and so on. And I think we're up now, and it's time to talk a bit about the Soundhouse Tapes.
Okay. All right. Well, what are your
So if you're still awake out there, now it's time to...
and this could go on. We could have done an entire episode on these early days of Iron Maiden because, like you said, there's people coming and going. There's, if you watch that early years DVD documentary that they did, they kind of piece it together somewhat decently for you, letting you know who's kind of coming in and out. But with Steve seems to have kept some kind of journal, which would be fascinating. I think you mentioned at one point if he were to release this or release some kind of biography, that would really be fascinating and might really help sort of put exact dates on some of these things. But you have to remember that this is so long ago when these things are happening. I mean, think about in your own personal life. If you try to remember 30, 40 years ago and you're trying to remember, was it October or was it November 30 years ago that something happened? It's difficult, if not impossible to do. And as we all know, things get blurry and you confuse this person with that person and this date. And especially early on, there were literally people coming in and out of the band that were in there for just a cup of coffee and then they're gone. So, but I think the main players like Dennis Wilcox, you mentioned, Doug Sampson, people like that. It's pretty clear on when they came in and everything like that. It's these guys that were there for 5 seconds or lasted for one or two gigs and things like that. But yeah, so that takes us up to the Soundhouse Tapes, which is the first official recording of Iron Maiden. You can hear some practice demos and things like that, early bootleg live recordings that people believe to exist, and some things do have leaked out there. But this is the first proper recording, and it should be noted that sometimes I mistakenly hear the Soundhouse tapes referred to as a demo. And they're not really a demo. A demo, if you want to get into the definition of these things, a demo tends to be when a band records, they make a recording and they're making it for the purpose of like maybe getting a record deal. This was very common in back in the 70s and the 80s. A band would make a demo, they would send it to record labels, or they might make a demo to try to get gigs or to try to get some press or something like that. But really, this is more of an official type of thing. They recorded this with the intention of releasing it to the fans as sort of and it was even
Mm,
done in a they only pressed 5,000 copies of it, and it was done strictly as kind of like this is for the diehard fans. At this point,
mm.
Iron Maiden is doing well in the club circuit. They're building a following. They feel like they want to put something out that they can give to the fans. As I mentioned in the introduction, it was something that they only sold through their mail order catalog. They've, of course, as Iron Maiden became popular, they they could have released more copies of this, and they even at that time when this came out, there were local record stores in London that wanted to carry this, but they wanted to keep it as something strictly for the die-hard fans. So that's something.
Actually,
Yeah, go ahead.
actually, it was like big chain stores like
Yeah,
His Master's Voice, because they were reading about Iron Maiden, and they were reading about, because there was this chart that was published in a music magazine called Sounds, and they had like the heavy metal chart, and among all these well-established known acts were this band Iron Maiden coming in and out, because Steve had left this cassette to the guy who ran the heavy metal disco at this place known as the Soundhouse. So I mean the big chain stores want to order, like, can we please have 20,000 of these? Can we
yeah,
buy stuff like that? And it's also fair to say that I think did they first recorded it just to get more gigs and to get their name out there. But since they were published in this chart, and they started to become a name in the circles of hard rock fans, they want to do this one off and make these 5,000 copies of this single, and they decided not to release anymore, which of course is a very very cool thing. But I mean, for a completist starting to collect Iron Maiden today, it's a bit of a nightmare because now it's very very expensive. Um, but let's get into the actual name first of the recording. Like I said, the Soundhouse Tapes, the name come from this pub called the Bandwagon. The Bandwagon had like a Western theme. I've seen some pictures from this place. It has some Western sort of theme when it comes to the interiors of this place. It's really really weird. And it was in Kingsbury in London, of course. And there was this guy Neil Kay, who Neil also wrote on the back sleeve of the single a short essay about the new wave of British heavy metal and Iron Maiden, of course, and that's on the sleeve there for you. And Neil Kay, like I said, he had those lists published, and I think it would be fun for you to hear what was on the heavy metal chart in Sounds. And I put it down here just to read it to you. That when, and this was from a list where Prowler was number one, and it was based on a sort of the requests from the audience there, like,
yeah.
play that song again. So Prowler was number one, and Iron Maiden, the song Iron Maiden was number 11. and this is from April 1979. So it's almost half a year before they actually pressed the single. They had Judas Priest, Tyrant at number 2, Motorhead, Overkill, UFO, Doctor Doctor, AC/DC, Riff Raff, Hearts, Crazy on You, and they had Black Sabbath, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath on that chart, and even Dire Straits, Sultans of Swing
A
for the heavy
little bit of
metal chart.
everything, something for
A bit of
everyone.
everything. But I mean, it's the competition is quite hard. That I mean, all these songs. I mean, you of course you could debate if a song like Sultans of Swing should be on a heavy
Yeah.
metal chart, but apparently it was requested by people going to this to the Soundhouse. But I think it's quite funny. I mean, all the other bands are well established, huge names.
So
So some of these songs.
what were they using then? See, in my mind, I always thought they recorded the Soundhouse single, which for those out there, it's a 7-inch single, which means that
Mm,
it's not a full size record. It's not a 12-inch record. It's a 7-inch single. I always thought they recorded that, and then that's what Neil Kay used to play at the club. But no, you're saying that they were already on the charts there. So what was he playing
mm.
at the club
Cassettes.
that the band had made?
Yeah, the band made cassettes and they handed out to like record labels, people here and there. I mean, Rod Smallwood also got a cassette through a friend of Steve's.
But what was
I
on the
think it was
cassette? Was it live recordings or was it them in the
no, no,
studio or?
no. The songs on Soundhouse Tapes from this recording
Oh,
session.
okay. So the date that you listed, okay, I misunderstood you. The date, right, the date that's because I thought you said the date of that chart was 6 months before the Soundhouse tapes had come out.
Yeah, and that's true. So the only place where people, the audience, the Maiden fans, could actually hear this was if they went to the bandwagon to the Soundhouse and asked Neil Kay, "Can you play that Iron Maiden song again that you have on tape?"
Oh, okay.
Because there were no official recordings out there for people to buy, and since people kept requesting of Neil Kay to play these songs, the band thought, maybe we should do a single of our own and release them
Got
because there
it.
seems
Okay.
to be a demand. And I mean, that's pretty cool if you ask me. That it's just purely on the demand of the public to be able to get these songs
So really the
that they
intention
actually.
when they recorded these songs was to pass out like to Neil Kay to for him to play and everything. And then because of the
Mm,
demand of it, then they thought, all right, well, let's give this to the fans. Let's press a limited number, 5,000
yeah.
copies of this or and give this out to the fans. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's so originally it did kind of start off as a demo. It was kind of a something to just give out for people to play.
Mm,
They didn't, but it eventually became a semi-independent release, an official release, if you will.
mm, absolutely. So it's kind of cool. Should we go into the various songs or?
Yeah, sure. So when did you I know you have for those out there in podcast land, Matthias has been holding up the record. He has an original copy of this record,
Mm,
which as we mentioned, with only 5,000 copies being released, it's very rare and hard to find because even though there were 5,000 copies, that doesn't mean that there's 5,000 copies still in existence. Somebody could have had it, lost it, damaged it, could be sitting in a box in somebody's attic and don't realize that it's up there.
mm.
So this is hard to find. So how did you come across this and what are your memories of, yeah, had you heard these songs before you got the record and
I had in a funny sort of way because even back in the 80s, I started to listen to Iron Maiden, like I mentioned in the introductory episode of this pod, like in 83, 84. So I very early on became aware of the Soundhouse tapes because when you read like biographies and when you read like early discographies of the band, the Soundhouse Tapes was always mentioned. But of course, I was just a kid, a teenager, and I didn't have the sort of contacts as I was about 10 when I started to listen to Iron Maiden, 9, 10. But pretty early on, one of the record stores that I frequented, Sin City Records in the town of Växjö in southern Sweden, he sold a bootleg version. And this bootleg version was pressed for some strange reason. It was in the slightly wrong speed. It wasn't like if you play like a 33 on 45, it wasn't that. It just went a bit too fast. So everything was kind of Mickey Mousey.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I ever heard it. I bought this very cheap bootleg and listened to them, and I think I understood even as like a 12. I must have been like 12 or 13 or something when I bought that. I understood there's something wrong here. I already then guessed it shouldn't really sound like that. Of course, it shouldn't. I bought my first proper single that was supposedly original one, and this must have been early 90s, very early 90s. I ordered it through mail order, and when I got it home, this was like you usually say it was a low information age. I only knew stuff that I had read in magazines or maybe heard on the radio or maybe had seen on TV. I mean, there was no way in hell for me to sort of get any details because I didn't really know any huge collectors that had an original version
Yeah.
of the Soundhouse tapes. So it took quite a few years before I found, and now we're internet age, where I found this guide online with this guy going, it should look like this, and just breaking down exactly what you should look for, like the matrix number on the
Yeah.
run-off groove. And if you have these signs on the run-off groove, then you know it's original one. So I mean, I must have had that the single for at least like 10 years or so before I even was dead sure I actually had an original one.
Wow.
And in the early 90s when I bought this, I think I paid something like in today $90, about $90.
Wow.
And that was by far the most expensive record I had ever bought at that time. I bought another version, bought a demo sort of early promo demo version of the Running Free single that cost like $60 or something. So
Yeah.
this was $30 more expensive.
And that was still a
So I mean,
steal
yeah,
by today, where it's at today.
this was like I said, many years ago. So to actually have the original one, put it on the turntable,
Yeah.
putting the needle down and actually hearing the songs. I think I had like a second or third or fourth generation copy on cassette or something, which was very noisy, of course, very
Yeah.
noisy. But to actually hear the single was very cool. And yeah, but I mean, like I said, I didn't know for sure until much later that it actually was.
The
And
real thing.
finding that guide online, it was like, do I actually dare?
Do I really want
Do
to
I
know?
dare?
I want to
Do I
believe
really
it's
want to
an
know?
original. I don't want to. Yeah, because it was for me, I didn't hear this till, oh my gosh. I mean, I knew it existed, but I think I got it on back in the 90s, to mid to late 90s. I used to go to record shows, and back then, this is before the internet, or the internet was very much in its infancy, and certainly before YouTube. So you would go to record shows, and there were always people that had tables set up that were bootleg CDs, and usually they were live recordings. But sometimes you would get something with like rare stuff on it, or maybe it had live recording with a couple rare songs tacked onto it. And I think mine, I can't remember now, but I'm pretty sure that that's where I heard it for the first time. It was on some sort of Iron Maiden bootleg thing. And yeah, it was probably a multi-generation copy thing. I remember the quality of it not being the greatest, but it was interesting because Maiden has, as everybody knows, Maiden has a lot of B-sides, and those are kind of
Mm.
fun to hear if you're somebody that's only heard the studio albums from Iron Maiden. It's kind of fun to hear these B-sides where they typically do cover songs, although there are occasional uh, original things, sometimes jokey type of original things. But so the Soundhouse Tapes is kind of this. Iron Maiden doesn't have a lot of like demos floating around and stuff like that. So this is kind of a legendary early recording, and it's something that I guess if we get into talking about it, I remember it's the sound quality, of course, isn't as good as their first album. The performances are not up to where they are on the first album. I mean, the song Iron Maiden and Prowler. And I would especially say Prowler. Prowler really comes off. The guitar sound is really almost cleanish, like it doesn't have the distortion, that opening riff, da 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 da. It's not quite as punchy and as heavy. So you can kind of hear that the band is not quite what they would become on the first record, but it's still almost there. I mean, I don't know if we mentioned already that on the tapes here, Soundhouse Tapes, we've got Paul Diano, of course, Dave Murray, Steve Harris, but we've got Doug Sampson on drums, and I think although not a bad drummer, he doesn't quite have the punch that Clive Burr does. And Paul Cairns on guitar. He goes uncredited on the original single, but maybe you want to explain to everybody about Paul Cairns and his involvement in the Soundhouse Tapes.
Well, he was a member of the band, and this has been confirmed by Paul Diano later on that yes, he was there. Online, you can find photographs of the band posing outside the studio, uh, and there are very few photos from the inside of the studio. But there's this one photograph with the lineup and Paul Kearns and his dog. He had a
Yeah.
dog that followed, and in the Maiden, uh, in the tales of Iron Maiden, this dog, just when they talk about Paul Kearns, they it always seems to mention that there was that bloke with that dog that
Yeah, he
went
always had his dog with him.
with him, and Paul Kearns had this nickname Mad Mac. I don't know why, but it was called Mad Mac for some reason. And so he was in the band, like I said, confirmed by, uh, and you can hear very very clearly if you listen to the recording that there are indeed two very different guitar players
Yeah.
on the recording. Because if it had been just Dave double tracking, uh, it the guitar sound would have been the same in both left and right speakers. But
Yeah.
when you listen to it, you can hear very very that Dave's tone is a bit more aggressive, has more grit, more distortion, whereas Paul's Kearns sound is unfortunately a bit clean, I would
Yeah.
say, a, even a bit weak. But yeah, so
It, it,
we
it
can say for sure that he is on that recording. There is two guitar players on the Soundhouse tape.
Yeah, and that's what jumps out for me is the tone of his guitar, especially sounds really kind of slightly out of place, if you will, or because it's just too clean. And interesting, I was getting ready for this episode, listening to the Soundhouse tapes on YouTube, and you can even Paul or someone claiming to be Paul commenting on one of the videos. They had it pinned at the top, and he was like, I played guitar on that. And he sort of explains a little bit about that Dave, I guess, had his Strat at the time. And I think he says that
mm,
he used a Les Paul and
mm,
everything. But yeah, you know, the guitar sounds are a little, that his sound is a little too clean for this. The tempos are a little bit slower, a little bit subdued. They're not quite at the energy level that they are on the first album. And I mean, we're gonna go through the tracks here, even though there's
mm,
only three of them. But uh yeah, I mean, it's you know, I wonder to myself if the first Iron Maiden album sounded like this, would Iron Maiden have been as popular as they were? Would their career have taken off? Because, and it's sort of a testament to sometimes the production of an album really has a lot to do with how the songs come across. Because even though
yeah.
Steve doesn't like the production of the first record has a nice, dry kind of live, you know, punchy, you know, the guitars are in your face, the bass is really loud, very simple sounding recording, but I think it's very effective. Whereas this kind of has a little bit of a cheap quality to it, which is
Mm,
understandable. They went in 2 days, they did it on a budget. They deliberately did it at the end of the year there, New Year's Eve, because they were able to get a better discounted price. And it should be mentioned too. I don't know if you want to talk about they intended to go back and master it again,
mm,
but
mm,
so for those that don't know, back then they were using analog tape. And the way
mm,
studios operated back then, analog tape was very expensive. So when a band would come in and record, they would offer to the band, you can buy the tapes for a price. And I guess, you know, from what I've read, the band thought that they told the studio to hold on to it, we'll be back. But the studio thought where they were holding on to it, didn't realize the band wanted to come back to touch it up, to remaster it, you know, to sort of
mm,
even out the levels and everything like that. So the studio just erased the tapes and used it for the next group that was coming in, which was common practice back then, because again, tape was
mm,
expensive. So bands come in, record it. They probably would make a copy for the cassette copy for the band to take
mm,
with them. But then they can't sit on these analog, you know, reel to reel tapes. You know, they have to reuse them. So maybe if the band had come back and, you know,
mm,
mastered it, maybe it would have been had a little bit more of a punchier, even more dynamic sound to it.
mm. Maybe, but I think in fairness, when we listen to this, so apparently it sounds like it was a bit of a rough mix, and maybe they want to do like a new mix and or master it to make it sound even better. But in all fairness, I think the the problems of the recording is in like the guitar tone of the second guitar player,
Yeah.
like Paul Kersdorf.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can't really, or rather, you couldn't do anything about and stuff like that in 1779. If you had it on tape, that was what it sounded like, more or less. Of course, you can EQ things, you
Right.
can like boost the treble or boost the mid or something like that, but
Yeah.
yeah,
You
I
can't
don't think it.
reamp it or right. And there's nothing
No,
you can do about the tempos. You know,
no.
that is what it is. Oddly, I think, and I understand why they didn't put Strange World on the record, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a 7-inch record. Typically you only fit one song on a side.
Mm,
And maybe they felt like it was a slow song and its Strange World is kind of long. I believe it clocks in like over 5 minutes. So maybe they felt like they just couldn't fit it on the 7-inch, or maybe they just felt like they didn't want a slow song like that on
mm,
there. I don't know. But I will say that the mix That's probably the mix lends itself to Strange World. That's the song that I
Mm,
think comes across the best or sounds the most like the version that would show up on the debut album. And I think
mm,
that's because there's a lot of clean guitar sound in it. It doesn't, so the lack of distortion and heaviness in the guitar tone, especially on Paul Caron's guitar, Strange World kind of masks that, or the cleaner guitar sounds fit, I guess, into Strange World a little bit better. So in a way, I think that's the one that sounds the most like what would end up on the
mm.
debut, whereas Iron Maiden and Prowler don't sound like. I think it's pretty obvious that, if we A-B'd them, people would be able to pick which one is which really easily. But I think Strange World is the closest to sounding like what they would sound like on the debut album.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I always assumed that it was just a time issue, that it was too long, that you couldn't fit the songs on a 7 inch. But I think in Lewis' book that I mentioned earlier, uh, they say, or someone says that the band thought it was too mellow. They
Yeah,
want to have like a harder edge, harder sort of. We're a heavy metal band, and they decided not to put that on the single because of that. I guess we'll never know for sure, but I don't know. But I totally agree with you that the that song is probably the one that sounds the best in that sort of soundscape.
yeah,
Let's put it. But if we take the song, so it starts off with the song Iron Maiden, and by far the Iron Maiden is the song that is the least benefited of the sound.
yeah,
Ironically enough, but I mean, it just doesn't sound good. I think it's when I listen to these recordings, when I listen to the Soundhouse tapes, it doesn't happen very often, I have to admit, but when I do, it feels a bit. It's very endearing. It's like listening to these versions. You can hear that there is something there, but they're not there yet.
yeah.
So
It's
so
like,
in that way, it's very, and I mean, it has some sort of energy for sure. But like you mentioned, Samson's drumming is he's almost playing like behind the band.
yeah, he's
So
not pushing it.
he's not pushing it at all. I mean, comparing to Clive, which is like, hold on to this rocket because we're going for a ride. You
Yeah,
have this drummer that's just maybe behind you a bit all the time. And for a song like Iron Maiden, uh, mm, it's okay. And you can hear in Paul's voice that Paul was at the time of this recording, I think the the least experienced musician in the band. Iron Maiden was like his first proper band. He had been in bands before, but that was, I mean, made out of mates doing
yeah,
playing together. I think they did a few gigs. He was in a band called Rock Candy before Iron Maiden. And going into Maiden, he was a bit, I wouldn't say reluctant, but he said somewhere that he didn't like initially get off on the type of music that Iron Maiden were playing. He didn't really think it was his type of music. That said, he does a very fine job, but his voice isn't really fully developed yet on these
yeah.
recordings.
It's almost kind of
But
like he doesn't have that grit to his voice yet, the aggressive sound to his voice. It's almost kind
mm,
of clean at times when you hear him sing, clean compared to where he would go a little bit later and, won't you come into my room, where it has that
oh,
sort of like strength to
wow,
it. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Here he kind of has, it's a little bit cleaner sounding, so that sounds a little bit straight. It sounds almost higher pitched. It's not really, it's just that his tone is a little bit on the brighter side, whereas I think by the time the debut album comes around, he adds this sort of chesty darkness to his
Mm.
sound. So that which fits the band really, really well. So here he sounds a little bit thin, a little bit bright. But it
It,
still should
it,
be said, as we're saying all this, back then, so many bands, especially in the 70s, it would take bands 2 to 3 albums before they found their sound. Think about Thin Lizzy. Think about the first
mm,
2 or 3 Thin Lizzy. Think about the first two UFO records. Just back then, it took bands a lot longer to find their sound. And here, yeah, they're not quite on it yet, but they're very, very close, and they're very to get almost there for considering they haven't been a band that long and they're still very young guys. I mean, what are they like in their early 20s at this point? So that's kind of what
yeah.
makes it very sort of charming is that you're hearing these young guys, inexperienced guys learning their craft, but you can tell why they became as popular as they did because they were really close to the Iron Maiden sound early on. It wasn't like these guys were messing around and they were a jazz rock group or they were a pop group or they were a space rock group or a blues jam band. No, I mean they were pretty darn close. And you can imagine that if they had had a better producer, that this could have sounded a little bit better. But here it's a little green. They're still finding their way as we move into Invasion. I think that that's a song that really sticks out for me as the one that's not as good as
Mm.
the other songs. But they're still pretty gosh darn close. And if the Sonics were a little bit better on this, I mean, this isn't that far off from when they do their debut record their debut albums. So you can hear that, credit to them that their first time in the studio, and it's not perfect and it's lacking in certain aspects, but you can definitely hear that these guys got raw talent. If I'm going to use a sports athletic thing, it's like a young kid gets on the team and he's got this raw talent. It just sort of needs to be molded a little bit. Well, I think that that's here. You can hear the Iron Maiden identity. It's not like if you played this for somebody, they'd be like, this is Iron Maiden. This doesn't even, like if you again go back to UFO, if you play the first UFO record, you're like, this is UFO.
Mm.
There's a lot of bands that are like the Scorpions, the first Scorpions record.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
like, is this the Scorpions? But I don't think
Mm.
that's really the case here. They're pretty close, but and that's like you said, what makes it sort of charming. It's that endearing. It's sort of like you're catching these guys in their embryonic stage. It's like it's starting, the connections are starting to come together. The chemicals are starting to react with each other, but you're watching it in this sort of embryonic stage here. It's just starting to form. So for that, it's a really great sort of snapshot of Iron Maiden, as they're bubbling up here, as they're starting to really become Iron Maiden. It catches them at a really good time. If they had done this, as you were mentioning earlier in the episode, these earlier incarnations of the band, and there are some like live recordings and
Mm.
rough practice things you can hear from those eras. And if they had recorded back then, yeah, it wouldn't have been, it would have been nowhere near like what this is. This was good timing for this. It's them right before they kind of everything falls into place for them as far as the lineup and their sound and the songwriting and
Mm.
everything like that. So this was timed really well. If this again had been one of these earlier incarnations of the band, maybe they wouldn't have gotten it wouldn't have taken off the way that it did for them.
No, and I mean, talking about the very song Iron Maiden, that was an old song that was done and played by the very first lineup of the band. And supposedly, one of the guitar players, Dave Sullivan, was the guy behind like the main riff of the song. But he has also said in interviews like, but Steve made it into a song, but the very guitar thing and I guess he's referring to the that that was his idea, but Steve made a song out of it. And talking about the, you were addressing the songwriting skills. It would be very, very interesting to hear like these early versions. How much did they actually change? How much did I? Because I mean, for the song Iron Maiden, Dennis Wilcock later on, much later on, I should say, said that he sort of rewrote some of the lyrics for the song, and there was this lawsuit a few years back where he tried to get money from the band for
Yeah.
co-writing a few songs, and this was one of the songs that he said, well, I sort of I changed the words around, and therefore I am one of the originators of the song. But they they made some sort of settlement outside of court or something. So there was never an official verdict or anything. What they agreed upon, we should never know, I guess. But at least it's like I said in the very, very long introduction, talking about all the steps leading up to the Soundhouse Tapes. There were quite a few musicians in the band, and they put their mark upon. And I guess like all bands, they must have done like rehearsal tapes, just having
Yeah.
a cassette recorder doing recordings. And I guess Steve has like quite a few of those lying around in his archives. So I mean, if we had those, we could like compare the all the stages and steps towards this very recording of the
Yeah.
band. But yeah, enough said about Iron Maiden. Let's talk a bit about the song Invasion. And first, I just have to say this before we say anything else about this. I don't know how many times I have read that Invasion is like an early incarnation of Invaders, like the first version of the song
Yeah.
Invaders. Just drop that. I don't want to hear that ever again. Please, please, everyone, stop saying that Invasion is the early version of Invaders. Okay, what we have here is like Invasion Invaders. Yeah, they lyrically they deal with
Yeah.
a
Norse.
Viking
Yeah.
invasion of the British Isles.
Yeah.
Period. There are no chords, no
Yeah.
guitar melody. There are no vocal lines that, in any way or capacity, anywhere near Invaders. So
Yeah.
let's just stop saying that Invasion is an early version of Invaders, please. Okay, I just had to get out of my chest. I mean,
Because I
if
was
you,
going to say that. Well, because I would say this, if you want to phrase it this way, it was a topic that Steve refined and did better on the song Invaders. I'd imagine that he had in his mind, like, I want to write a song about Vikings invading, right? And so you
hmm?
get this early version, Invasion, and which in my opinion is not really that great. It's sort of this it's a song that and he fine tunes that and he revisits this later on when he does Invaders. He's like, oh, I've always wanted to, do that theme. And it didn't really work on Invasion. So here we are on Invaders.
Mm.
But this is the song that I mentioned as I was praising about how this is how fully developed or close to fully developed they are on this single here. This is a song that shows that they weren't there yet, and this is a song that doesn't really. It's not a good song in my opinion. It's awkward. I don't like the verse. The verse has almost this like happy feel to it, and that whole like the Norsemen are coming, the Norsemen are coming, like that whole part is just it just doesn't quite work. And again, this is them learning their songcraft. And there's a reason why Invasion wasn't re-recorded on the debut album, because I'm sure they were aware that this song wasn't that good. And as they were writing more songs, this song gets pushed it aside. And as any band, anybody who's out there that's been in a band that's written music, you write stuff, and as you write better stuff, you forget about the stuff that wasn't as good. So this
Mm,
is one of those songs that sort of gets forgotten about. It gets sort of pushed aside. It's interesting because it's early Iron Maiden. It's early Iron Maiden with Paul Di'Anno, which there's a limited amount of original songs with Paul Di'Anno, Paul only having two studio albums. So, for a historical perspective, it's fun and everything, but it's quite
mm,
clear that you can kind of hear what Steve is trying to do. You can hear the Steve isms, the tempo changes, but it's just doesn't work. And if this was a session, they have a producer and they're doing their first album, this is a song that the producer would say, you know what, this just doesn't fit. It doesn't cut it. Yeah, let's just leave this one on the floor or put it as a B-side or something like that. But
mm,
here in their developmental stage, which is strange too, because Strange World would have been much better here. You would have had two
mm,
fast songs. Side two of the single would have opened with Strange World. But then again, that would have put here Invasion is only 3 minutes 7 seconds. Iron Maiden is 4 minutes 1 second. Prowler is 4 minutes 20 seconds. So I believe the version of Strange World is something like 5 minutes 30 seconds. That would have pushed side two to 9 minutes 20 seconds. You couldn't have put it on side one. That would have pushed it to the same length, basically.
mm.
So
Yeah.
maybe that was the consideration also, but if time wasn't in the limitations of the format, the vinyl format, for those who don't know out there, if you put too much music on the side of any kind of record, a 7 inch, a 12 inch,
Mm,
you start sacrificing sound quality because to simplify it, the grooves have to get closer together to squeeze all the grooves in on the record. So maybe that was a consideration, but otherwise, it reminds me a little bit like Women in Uniform. It's just, and even though Women in Uniform is a cover song, it sounds like this weird, odd thing from their early days that just doesn't fit in with where they are. So cool subject matter, but the music doesn't match. Let's not compare it to Invaders, but if we're to compare lyrical subject matter, Viking Raids fits more the vibe of Invaders. The music fits what the lyrics are, whereas here on Invasion, it's very strange. Like the verse has this almost like poppy major key quality to it, and the tempo changes there, and the way the lyrics are crammed in, the way Paul's spitting out those lyrics, it just kind of doesn't work.
Okay, just to contradict that, I sort of enjoy this song, and I think I am one of the few in the world. I was thinking about that earlier. Whenever you say something bad about the song, there's always this one bloke somewhere in the world going, "Oh no, that's the best song they've ever done, man! I can't believe you don't like that song." So let me, for a few seconds, just be
And you're
that
that
guy.
bloke.
Here I am. He lives in
We were
Sweden,
lucky enough to
apparently.
have you on this podcast, the one bloke out there, and he just so happens to be here on this podcast.
Okay,
Take it
okay,
away.
maybe I will take it away. Okay, I sort of agree with what you're saying. I haven't really thought about this, but I think that the reason why it's on there is because Invasion at the time of recording was like a new song, and I think like, I mean, people who have played in bands, usually when you have a new song, you feel like, okay, oh, I like this new song, let's play it again, and you sort of, your head isn't really bored or tired of it yet. So maybe Invasion was that song. It was a newish song. It was written in 78, and the Soundhouse Tapes were recorded in like late December of 78. So I think that's the reason why it's there actually. Like I said before, Iron Maiden was done in the very early days of the band, and Prowler, the next song, was done somewhere around 1976. So Invasion, new song. Uh, I think this is the song where you can hear that Doug Sampson isn't the drummer for Iron Maiden. When it comes to the Norsemen are coming,
Yeah, yeah.
it just feels like he's not pushing it. He's just
Hanging
the
on.
tom the yeah the toms he's playing is like all over the place. It's not distinct enough. It's and I mean, of course, they were only there for like a day, 2 days doing all of it. So they just had to do like the best. Actually, a fun thing about this song, when you listen to those three songs, Invasion is the only song where you can hear them playing something wrong. You can hear that Paul Kearns, the supposedly Paul Kearns, is actually doing a mistake in this song. It's one of the and he just drops out all of a sudden, like he's dropping a pick or something, or he just
Yeah.
something happens. And I mean, adds up to the endearment
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
track that you can hear. Okay, he's not even playing it right. He's missing out here because he's dropping a pick or something.
And you might be onto
But
something there because I just looked on setlist.fm, which for those who don't know, it's a website where you can go back and see how many times a band played a particular song or set lists from tours. Now, as you go farther back, they're relying on people submitting this information, but so it may not be 100% accurate. This is not something put out there by the band, but according to setlist.fm, they played this song 7 times in 1979. And that's the only time they ever played it was 7 times in 1979. And according to this, the first time it was played was December 19th at the Music Machine, which would have put it after the release of the record. So you may be onto something there that they may have thought, hey, we've got this new song. Let's put this on there. It'll be like, here's two songs you've heard us play live a bunch of times, but here's a song you haven't heard us play live
mm,
at this point. So somebody who bought this record, that would have been when it came out, which was released in November 9th of 1979. Whoever bought this, that would have been a song that they had never heard the band play before, if you're going by setlist.fm.
yeah, yeah. It's not the most reliable of sources, should be mentioned, but of course, I think that was the case. That it was a new song they want to do. The part that I actually like of the song is the mid section where they go do 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 with just
Yeah,
the
that
guitars.
sounds like classic Maiden.
Yeah, and I mean this is a Steve song, and I think this is one of the here he's learning something. Now he's doing something that is one step closer to the Iron Maiden that we all know and love. But like I said, I agree with you. It's not the best song, and it's when the band went into the studio to record the first album, they sort of let's not do that one. But yeah, Invasion. I sort of like it. I enjoy it. I think it's some sort of fun energy to it. But I mean, most of the lyrics are quite. It's hard. You can hear that Paul struggles singing it, and there's a re-recording of that song for the B-side of Women in Uniform, but the tempo is much higher. It's of course it's Clive
Yeah.
Burr on drums. I mean, it's almost impossible for Paul to sing that song, which is
Yeah.
also quite funny. But yeah, that's Invasion for you. So the final song on the single is Prowler. And like I said before, it was a very popular song. And the song was made by Steve and hidden credit to Dennis Wilcock for the lyrics. Like I said earlier, he had this stage persona where he dressed out as the prowler, prowling the stage. And I mean, let's be fair, the lyric of the song is awkward, to say the least. So,
Yeah.
uh, if I was Steve, I would say, let's give him the credit for that. I don't want to be associated with that lyric.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
I think, again, like you said, this is a really good song. And it's recorded, like I said, here's another thing that was recorded late 78. There are BBC session recorded in, I think, October, November of 79 with Doug Sampson on drums. And talking about Doug's playing, when you listen to the BBC session from the later part of 79, his drumming has for sure improved. He is much more aggressive in his style. He's not Clive Burr aggressive, because that's like another level
Mm-hmm.
of aggressive drums. But comparing his recording in around New Year in 78 and the autumn recording for the BBC, it's like, okay, he's improved a lot. The tempo is a bit higher, it's more aggressive. But that said, the sounds, like you talked about, the guitar sounds for Prowler, doesn't really match the song. It's just too. And the first guitar that you hear is Paul Kern's guitar,
Yeah.
because it's Dave playing the lead. That da, 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 da. So it's Paul Kearns doing that,
Yeah.
and he's not off in time even. It's like he's, I don't know if they.
Yeah, he's sort of like fumbling it ever so slightly. It's like slightly, yeah, it's like he didn't get a good start to it or something. Yeah, it's really strange.
Mm.
Yeah, and
But
for everybody out there who's keeping track of stuff like this, Matthias just mentioned the BBC sessions, and the BBC sessions, all of Iron Maiden's, or I think all of Iron Maiden's BBC stuff was released in the what was it called, the Ed box, uh, the Eddie the Head box or something.
no,
And they've been released separately, and they're on the streaming services. So if you want to hear these things, you can go and just look up Iron Maiden, the BBC sessions, and you can hear some of these early BBC stuff, which is the BBC stuff is fascinating for those who maybe haven't heard any BBC stuff from any band. This was common back then for British bands or any bands to go in and they would record a couple songs. So it's sort of like a studio recording, but it's kind of live, but it's like somewhere halfway between live and a studio recording. Sometimes you'll even hear overdubs and things like that being added into these things. So it's pretty fascinating to hear an early sort of semi-live, half in the studio type of thing from Iron Maiden. So definitely seek that out. But yeah, you're exactly right. The first thing that's jarring is that guitar tone. It's just like, whoa, like he forgot to turn his his distortion on, forgot to step on his pedal or something because it's way too clean. And yeah, it's just kind of they're kind of struggling to really lock into it's like it takes them a second to sort of lock into the song. It isn't until the
mm,
verse kicks in that it's really tight. And it's interesting because again, you think about these things, these little things that make a big difference.
mm,
The guitar tones, the tightness of the band's playing, the drummer giving it some more energy, the production. That when you add all these little things up, you get the debut album. And
mm,
here they're lacking in some of these things. So even though they're close, they still need to fine tune some of these elements. They still haven't settled on the appropriate lineup for the band to really get these songs across the way they need to be, the way they need to be done. But otherwise, it's it's a little slow. It doesn't have, again, have quite the kick that it does on the debut album. But
I think when you, another point, when you listen to the song, when you go to the diddle 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 parts, that's so obvious that it's not there. The
yeah,
drumming is, it just gets messy and
yeah,
muddly, kind of all over the place. So yeah, and I mean the guitar tone. We keep coming back to that, but it's like your guitar is too loud. You have to turn it down, or something.
Yeah.
It's so remarkably weak in tone and single. It's like,
Yeah.
why? Why? I just don't get it. But
It's shocking that nobody stopped them and just said like, but again, they were on a budget. And even though there's a mixer and an engineer here, I'm sure that at this stage that these guys were just they're just hiring the studio and the band's just going in and playing. They're probably giving them zero guidance. They're not uh, you know, like a
no,
producer
no,
might
no,
have said, "Hey,
no,
you
no,
should
no.
do this, you should do that." They're not giving them any kind of guidance. But I guess we could also mention here if you want to wrap up the Iron Maiden studio recordings, officially released stuff before the debut
Hmm?
album. We can mention the Metal from Others, which
Hmm?
was a compilation album. I've got it back there behind my shoulder. Matthias is holding up his copy of it. And it was a compilation album that brought together a bunch of the new wave of British heavy metal bands at that time, like Angel Witch is on there. And Iron Maiden contributes Wrathchild and Sanctuary. And the sound quality on those really does not do the band any favors. Like Wrathchild just sounds really lacking in punch. It's like the mix is just not particularly good at all. But what is the lineup on the Metal from Others versions?
It's the same that that's on the Soundhouse tapes. Steve, it's Paul, it's Dave, and it's drummer Doug Sampson. But it's also a guitar player who was in the band for like a few weeks only, and his name is Tony Parsons. And Tony Parsons, I would say, is a much better guitar player, have a better tone, more aggressive style. For Iron Maiden. But like I said, he was only in the band for a few weeks, and I mean, good for him because during those weeks, all things happened for Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
They did a BBC session, they did a recording for Metal for Mothers, and I mean, Metal for Mothers was recorded in a proper EMI studio.
Yeah.
Uh, so they were sort of to find a like a producer guy. Could you work with this guy? So from the perspective of the EMI, you could say that recording these two songs in an EMI studio with a guy called Neil Harrison was like, does this guy works for you? And the band listened to the recording and said, no, he's not the guy. Uh, and I mean, listening to, we won't go into details about these two songs, but at the time, Rothschild and Sanctuary were like the two big fan favorites.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's really, really weird that they decided to record and just give away their two greatest hits, so to
Yeah.
say, for a compilation album when they sort of knew that we're going to get this deal with EMI. We're going to go into the studio, most probably, and record our debut album in some months or something. And then they decide to put these two songs on. And Iron Maiden is the only artist or band on the Metal for Mothers that has two
Two
songs on.
songs. Yeah.
So it's a bad career move on the band's behalf to do that. There was also another recording session done previous to the recording of the band debut, and by mistake, they a demo version, the song "Running Free" ended up on a compilation called Axe Attack, and it has bands like Black Sabbath, AC/DC, Motorhead, Ian Gillan, Rainbow, Judas Priest, and Whitesnake. And on this, there is a, like I said, a demo version recorded also in EMI studio with another guy, like a sort of tryout. Does this guy works for you? And the band said, no, he doesn't work. So and I think what happened was when they made the first pressing of this compilation album, someone at the EMI had this song running free, and when they were compiling the album, some technician or archives guy sort of Iron Maiden running free, it said on a tape somewhere, and they said, okay, this is a song they want for the compilation album, not knowing that they wanted the proper version recorded for the debut, because this Axe Attack, the compilation was put out later, after the first album was already out.
Yeah.
So when this compilation came out, it wasn't like, I mean, it's so obvious when you look on the bands featured on the Metal from Others that it's like a sort of a tryout by the EMI to see, okay, do we get requests for any of these bands? Samson was already a recording band. They are also on there. And that was before Bruce was in the band, I have to say, doing a great song called Tomorrow Yesterday. But when they put out the Axe Attack, that was like, okay, Iron Maiden is this name now.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's why they're on a compilation with, like I said, Ian Gill and Judas Priest, Scorpions, there's UFO and Girl School. I mean, big names, Black Sabbath. How big can it get? But by mistake, and if you listen to that version, because that version is a record, Doug Samson recorded the drums on. And if you compare those two, that's really interesting, actually. If you compare the Doug Samson running free version to the Clive Burr version. Because where Dogs just keeps playing to pretty much all the way through the song.
Yeah.
Dave plays it more aggressive. He do some toms. He just makes more music out of the drum part than what Doug does. And so that's interesting on that. And this Axe Attack is quite hard to find, actually, because compilation albums, most people who maybe has these doesn't really know that they have like the first pressing original version with the wrong version of running free. So but these are the recordings they made prior to getting Clive in the band, Dennis Stratton in the band. They have signed now 2 EMI records with Doug Samson still in the band. So he has signed the contract, but he has to leave the band. And now we're in the very late of 1979, December of 79. And now the band has to fill the spot, guitar player, the drummer, and they have a recording to make in just a few weeks. And with that cliffhanger,
we will leave you for our next episode.
Exactly, because I mean, let's save
that
all that
sets us up. For the debut album.
But I mean, rounding all this off, I think it's quite interesting, like you said before, that listening to the Soundhouse tapes, you hear that what's there, and you also hear what's not there. And I mean, we have talked about it again and again, that apart from Dave's guitars, they need something more in the guitar department. And in all fairness, like you said, I think Doug Samson is a okay, good drummer, but he isn't the drummer for Iron Maiden. Even though he wasn't kicked out of the band because he was crap, he had to leave the band because he had health issues. We don't know what these health issues are, and Doug Samson himself have never really talked about what his health issues were about. But he had to leave the band because they knew that we got tours coming up. They had the Metal for Mothers tour coming up early 1980. And they went on this tour with Praying Mantis. And Praying Mantis was another band that was very much up and coming. And I think if we had a time capsule and could go back to 1980, if you had talked to like the record executives, you have to choose Iron Maiden or Praying Mantis. My bet is that most record executives would have gone with Praying Mantis, like the next big thing.
Yeah.
But as history has proven, they were wrong.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we wrap up the episode, as I mentioned at the beginning, that as of the recording of this, Paul Di'Anno has passed, and we just thought we would say a few words in tribute to Paul. I would say that in our introductory episode, I talked about how my first exposure to Iron Maiden was the Live at the Rainbow video, which had Paul Di'Anno in it. So Paul was the first Iron Maiden vocalist that I heard. My first Iron Maiden album was the debut album. And I think Paul brought this real kind of tough street edge type of sound to Iron Maiden. I think he was the perfect pub. That's not to diminish him, like that he couldn't be on a bigger stage, but he had that sort of personality that he could deliver in an intimate setting like a pub when you do see these early videos of Iron Maiden. But he also worked on a big stage. He had a very cool look. I remember thinking it was strange that he had short hair, but at that
Mm,
time I was too young to understand the whole London punk thing and all that. I didn't get it, but I thought he looked cool. He had the bullet belt, the leather jacket, just that whole vibe to him. He had this kind of just cool look about him. And somebody commented, we did a video tribute on my Layer of the Alchemist channel, and somebody commented in the video, everybody brings up Paul's short hair, but Adrian had short hair when he joined the group.
mm,
But Adrian wasn't the lead singer, and that was the difference. But I think Paul had a real commanding presence. I think he had a really unique voice, that sort of
mm,
gruff, tough quality to his sound, and it matched his look too. He wasn't one of these guys like you saw him and then you heard him sing and you say, I didn't expect to hear that voice out of him. When you saw
mm,
Paul and then you heard him sing, you're like, yeah, that's the kind of voice I expect out of a guy that looks like that. And even though Paul had health issues, it's still shocking to hear of his passing because he's part of my youth. Again, the first Iron Maiden singer I had heard. He's very much a huge part of metal history. Those first two Iron
mm,
Maiden albums are groundbreaking. So Paul's contribution to those albums are huge. So yeah, it's a sad day. He was a very unique singer. He had a very unique look and he had a very unique personality. So I think that
mm,
yeah, it's very sad to hear of his passing.
mm. I think when we record this, he died just a few days ago, literally, and I think it's a bit early to sort of do a big take on his career and so on. But just to keep it nice and short for the pod, I think that Paul was very important to Maiden, and comparing the voices of Paul and his predecessor Dennis Wilcock is like Paul was next level shit. He was a huge step forward for the band to get someone with his voice quality. And I would say that Paul's quality as a singer is all too often overshadowed by his bad boy sort of persona that he was so keen to hang on to. Uh, he Paul had the ability to have a very tender voice, uh, but he could also like switch on a danger. Like
Yeah.
when you hear him sing, especially some songs on Killers, it's like it doesn't sound nice. It sounds like there's an element of danger when it sings, and that I would say, even though we're talking about hard rock and heavy metal, that is actually a rare quality to a singer, because
Yeah.
very often someone, they try to do that by doing some sort of growl voice.
Yeah.
But with Paul, it just felt when he switched that on, that it's some sinister quality to it that is just Paul Diano, which is, that's his thing. And as I said before, at the same time, he could also do these very mellow, tender things. So as a singer, as a musician, I would say that Paul Diano is extremely underrated. Because, and I'm a, it's one of my mistakes too when we talk about Paul. It's so easy to start to talk about his behavior, the way his career moves. It's like uh, hard to talk about sometimes. Uh, but as the vocalist for Iron Maiden, doing those songs for that version of Iron Maiden was 5 out of 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't hear, and I have heard Bruce Dickinson, who is a great vocalist, a great storyteller when it comes to the vocal delivery, and he still can't really capture or reenact that sort of danger to his voice, because it's not just there. He isn't Paul Diano.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. We will talk tons about Paul Diano, his voice, and what he brings to the songs when we go into the debut album, and of course Killers, which is by far, if you ask me, the highlight of his entire career. What he does on Killers is extremely good, extremely good. But yeah, short and sweet. That's what I have to say about Paul Diano in Iron Maiden.
All right. Well, there you go. This is our first proper episode wrapped up, the Soundhouse Tapes. We'll be moving on to the debut album next. For everybody out there in podcast land, you can see the video of this, the full video of this, on my Layer the Alchemist YouTube channel. We're going to do our best to post these episodes maybe on the first Wednesday of every month, because we do this thing we call Midweek Maiden on my YouTube channel, or maybe we'll just have it on the first of the month. We'll see as we go along here, but we're going to try to do an episode a month. You can also check out, I have two other podcasts that I do. I have a Black Sabbath podcast that I do with my friend Darren called Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast available on all the podcast networks, and a podcast that I do with author and friend Martin Popoff called Kicked in the Teeth, an AC/DC podcast. So make sure you check out all those things out there, and we'll see you at the next episode, which will be the debut album. And just remember that Iron Maiden's gonna get ya.